Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. Once again, I'm your host, Erik Bjornstad, and I'll be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. Here at the podcast, we talk about all of the factors and considerations that come into play when you're talking about all the different kinds of fuel that we have to use, not only in our professional lives, like on the job, but also the stuff that we use personally, as well as all of the engines and the equipment and the things that we use that use that fuel, both professionally on the job, but then also things we use at home to make our lives easier. And so that means the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is really for everybody. So with that in mind, what are we going to talk about on today's episode of the podcast? This is a piggyback off of last episode that we did, where we were talking about the predictions for the 2025 Atlantic hurricane season. Now, if you remember, we said that the predictions thus far are that it's going to be a relatively normal season. I think they said 15 named storms, about 7 to 8 hurricanes, 3 major hurricanes was the consensus. And all of those numbers slot into what a typical hurricane season has been over the last 30 years or so. Now, there was a little bit of difference of opinion between some of the groups in what they call the ACE index. ACE index is a mathematical compilation that they put together that expresses numerically how powerful all the sum total of all the storms were in a given season. And there was a little bit of disagreement between the groups that offered these predictions. Colorado State University, I believe, thinks we're going to have an above average. They said ACE index of 155, which is about 25% higher than normal. But other groups like Tropical Storm Risk Group predict a lot closer to an average ACE index of about 110. And the biggest reason for that difference, we found out, was a difference in how they view the sea temperatures are going to be. Colorado State seems to think that we're going to have warmer than average Atlantic hurricane season, sea surface temperatures, rather. Whereas Tropical Storm Risk and Arizona State University think they're going to be closer to normal. And really, I think that's going to be the big determinant, because warm water is really the biggest primary driver for whether you're going to have unusually high number of storms and more powerful storms. How warm is that water? That is what we talked about last time. Then what we said is, for this episode, now we're going to talk about not about how bad they're going to be, but what does that tell us? What do these predictions for the hurricane season tell us about what we should be doing to prepare for the Atlantic hurricane season? Even if a storm is supposed to be quiet in aggregate, right? It just takes one storm hitting the right place at the right time in order to make the whole thing be a really bad event. Now, hurricane season, typically, we said that it runs from June the 1st through the end of November. Typically, the beginning part of hurricane season is usually quiet. It's really unusual to get, let's say, a major hurricane at the beginning of hurricane season. That's what we had last year with Hurricane Beryl. It's really the first time in recent memory that it had ever happened. In the early to midsummer, even though that's hurricane season, it's typically still quiet. So if you are in a region of the country, like we are here in Florida, if you're in a region of the country that geographically would have reason to be concerned with hurricane activity, you have got time to prepare. But the time to prepare is right now. You do not want to let that get away from you, as much as the temptation might be for that to happen. So, what we're going to ask is there anything that you need to do to prepare for hurricane season if you are in an industry or a sector where emergency backup fuel plays an important role in what you're doing? Now, there are general recommendations for everybody on what you should do to prepare for hurricane season. Then there's also things that are specific for certain sectors that rely on emergency backup fuel, like healthcare environments. Telecom installations are two really good examples of this. Healthcare environments and telecom, they have overlapping priorities, but they also each have their own unique challenges when it comes to their emergency fuel use during hurricane season. So today we're going to talk about some recommendations, both general recommendations for everybody, and then specific recommendations for those two sectors. Okay, so let's start. First recommendation. Emergency backup fuel quality must be reliable, no exceptions. That means the recommendation for you is test your emergency backup diesel fuel for water, microbial contamination, and degradation. You should be testing them every 3 to 6 months. So, when you would want to do that relative to hurricane season coming up upon us really depends on when you last tested your fuel. If you last tested your fuel back in 2024, it was before the start of the year, then you definitely want to do that now, before hurricane season gets underway. Now, healthcare and telecom have some additional wrinkles of specificity that come into play. For the healthcare industry, you are wanting to ensure that your fuel quality complies with NFPA 110 standards. That's what you have to worry about with the healthcare industry. And NFPA 110 has certain standards, like they have a limit on, let's say, the percentage of water by volume that you can have in your storage tank. That's going to be one of your guiding sets of requirements, is what NFPA 110 says about your fuel. And so you're going to need to stick to it. Now, for telecom, you've got this wrinkle that your critical sites like your cell towers and your switch centers, those kind of installations tend to use smaller storage tanks. Smaller storage tanks are more vulnerable to condensation and development of microbial growth, which means if you are in the telecom industry and you have any kind of responsibility for emergency backup fuel, the fact that your smaller tanks are more vulnerable to those problem-causing things means you are going to want to test more frequently than 3 to 6 months. Okay, so that's recommendation number 1. Test your fuel now to confirm its quality. Recommendation number 2, after checking your fuel quality, is conduct full generator load tests. That means testing your generators under real operational load conditions, not just doing a startup check and then thinking that you've done everything that you need to. Now, real operational loads or full generator load tests are going to look a little bit different for different sectors. In the healthcare industry, they have some requirements already. CMS and Joint Commission already require doing at least 30 minutes of testing, at least 30% load every single month, plus an additional 4-hour load test annually. Now, if you are in the healthcare industry and any of that intersects with your professional responsibilities, it's likely that you already know this. And so it's very likely that you're already in compliance with this. And so the only thing that we would need to stress there is, again, if you didn't know already, the importance of documenting everything. Okay, what about telecom? Here, you want to simulate full site failure, very importantly, including battery backup depletion. And it's because you're aiming to confirm that if that happens to you, if that happens in your area, you're aiming to confirm that there will actually be a seamless switchover from UPS to generator without it causing anything like dropped calls or cutting service. Now, this kind of testing, this kind of comprehensive load testing, can sometimes get skipped in telecom. But it's still really important to do because the kind of testing that we're talking about here, it's going to show you things. It's going to tell you things that you may not be able to see otherwise. And what you're looking for is, you're going to be looking for things that are specifically related to generator performance, related to fuel reliability, and related to switchover integrity. Now, Most telecom facilities, and again, if you're in telecom, you already know this, or we're just saying it for everyone else's benefit. Most telecom facilities, by facilities, we're talking about switching centers, we're talking about small cell nodes, talking about data hubs. Most telecom facilities have these layers of redundancy when it comes to maintaining power. They start with getting their primary power from the power grid. Okay. If the power grid goes down, the redundancy is it switches to battery backup, that UPS thing that we reference. But if the battery backup fails, then you have a diesel backup generator that is supposed to switch on. It's supposed to come into play as the third layer of redundancy. So the real test of your system reliability or system resilience, if you will, it doesn't come from just starting that generator up and making sure that it starts. The real test of your system resilience comes from confirming that your system is going to automatically switch over to the generator when both the grid power and the battery fail. You're confirming that your fuel system that generator uses and the generator relies on, you're confirming that the fuel system reliably or will reliably feed the generator without issues. Issues like clogging the fuel line or having air in the fuel lines or having fuel degradation. So you're also confirming, not only that, you're also confirming that your critical systems are going to stay online throughout an entire failover process, if you will. Now, how exactly you do all of this depends to a certain extent on the protocols laid out for your system. So we can't really sit here and tell everybody in telecom every single step that's going to apply to everybody. It's not really the place for us to lay out a comprehensive plan that's going to define the steps for everybody in the telecom industry because everybody's system is a little bit different. But from a general standpoint, kind of load testing that people in the telecom industry should do in preparation for hurricane season, it's going to involve basic steps of isolating the site from grid power, number one, forcing the site to then drain the battery system, number two, and then verifying that the diesel generator, remember that third layer of redundancy, verifying that the diesel generator is then going to kick on within the required time delay period, which is supposed to be between 10 and 30 seconds after the system detects a low battery voltage situation. So this kind of testing, it's verifying that the generator is going to carry the full site load without any voltage drop, without any brownout. It's verifying that the generator transfers load automatically via the automatic transfer switch as it's supposed to do. And it's verifying whether it maintains stable frequency for digital loads. And then while all this is happening, you're taking the opportunity to also check the generator fuel system. Are there any pressure drops? Are the system filters functional, or do they exhibit evidence of clogs or something that might cause fuel starvation? Is there any smoke, any surge on startup? Is the fuel consumption rate under the real load, is it close to what it's supposed to be? This kind of thing, or these kinds of things, like whether your entire power redundancy chain works as opposed to just the generator, that can really only be confirmed under this kind of full load test scenario. And this is the time for you to make it happen. This is the calm before the upcoming storms. Something that you're going to want to do in advance of hurricane season so that you're prepared for that worst case scenario. Basically, time that you want to do all of this is right now. So that's the second thing. Third thing, you've got a plan to secure sufficient fuel inventory to cover possible multi-day outages during a hurricane season event. Now, you have a backup system, but you can't run backup systems without fuel, right? Seems self-evident. This is the time to make sure that you've got access to enough fuel for an emergency. You are not going to want to wait till the hurricane's bearing down on you to verify, make sure that you can get fuel if you need it. Now, for general recommendation, you should be able, because you know your system best, you should be able to calculate how much fuel you would need based on what you know about your system's fuel consumption. And that's fuel consumption both during its average load period and then also fuel consumption during peak load as well. You don't want to forget to take that into account as well. Now, those of you in the healthcare sector, you know that you already have a requirement that governs this. NFPA 99 recommends all healthcare facilities have enough viable fuel to run their backup systems for at least, how long? 96 hours. That's 4 full 24-hour days. So for your system, you will likely know how much fuel volume that is required to be. Now, when I was thinking about how to talk about this, what came to mind here is, if any of you have Netflix, right? There is a new medical show, new as of April 2025. There's a new medical show in there called Pulse. And it centers around things that go on with emergency room doctors in a hospital in Miami. Miami being a prime hurricane strike zone, right? And in the first season of Pulse, a couple of the episodes, the story arc for a couple of the episodes in the middle of the season had to do with the fact that a hurricane is bearing down upon Miami and it's going to hit this hospital. And what happens in the series is the hospital runs out of fuel. And they say, oh, that's not a problem. We're supposed to be getting a fuel delivery. And then they find out that, I don't know, FEMA or whoever it was, diverted their fuel with the fuel that they were supposed to get to someplace else. And they're all scrambling around because they don't have enough fuel to run their backup systems. You can imagine the problems that causes. And I'm watching this and I'm like, that actually is extraordinarily unlikely to happen in real life because that hospital, it's a major hospital in Miami. And you can almost bet your mortgage on the fact that hospital is going to be in compliance with NFPA 99, which means that hospital would already have backup fuel for at least 96 hours. That's just an example of a portrayal in popular culture that actually intersects with what the regulations say a hospital needs to have. Okay, so that's hospitals and healthcare. What about telecom? Those of us in the telecom sector, what's your priority here when it comes to scheduling fuel, making sure that you have enough fuel to do what you need to do during a hurricane event? Your priority is going to be to keep your tier 1 hub online if the remote towers go offline temporarily. Now, again, you know your system best. So what you're going to be aiming to do is identify the priority sites in your system that are most essential to making that happen. And then you're going to want to set up fuel ration protocols, and you're going to want to pre-arrange fueling resupply routes to make sure that those essential sites have what they need to keep those tier 1 hubs online. So that is the third recommendation. Fourth recommendation, now is the time to harden your infrastructure against storm damage. What does that mean? That's going to mean doing things that protect your essential fuel systems from being interfered with by flooding, wind-blown debris, fuel line damage, all the nice things that go along with a hurricane strike where you are. Now, what exactly this is going to look like, again, depends on the uniqueness of your situation. On the healthcare side, it's typically common to look at doing things like elevating or enclosing day tanks, and especially transfer pumps. Those are very important because floodwaters can breach underground tanks. So you want to make sure that those kinds of things are elevated, at least to minimize the chance of that happening. Now, on the telecom side, there's a different... Telecom also has to worry about this kind of thing too, but there's another thing on the telecom side that you have to worry about. And that is the possibility that after a hurricane hits everything and moves on through, there's going to be a lot of chaos, right? There's going to be a lot of disarray. And what you want to think about is possibility of people coming in after a disaster and making off with things that you don't want them to have. That could mean you want to install tamper-proof enclosures at your remote sites to prevent fuel theft post-storm. Fuel theft after a major storm is more common than you might think. If we look back last year, 2024, between June and August 2024, that's only what? June, July, August, 3 months. There were over 4,000 reports of theft of things from telecom sites. So when things are in disarray after a major storm hits, you can bet that there are people out there who might have their eye on unsecured sites. You don't want it to be yours. What do? Have their eye on sites for what? People love to take copper cables. And if they know that a site has copper cables, they're going to go in if it's not secured. And in trying to take those copper cables, they might cause other damage, like they might mistakenly cut fiber optic lines. That's not good, right? Copper, they'll target batteries and power equipment. And if they can take a backup generator, they will. Make sure you take the time now to minimize the chances of that kind of thing happening. Okay, fifth thing you should do on the preparation side is coordinate your vendor and emergency fuel deliveries. Take the time now to make sure that you've got priority contracts lined up with not one, but multiple fuel vendors. And along these lines, for getting the fuel supplies that you need, it can help if you're part of a coalition of purchasers that can plan and work together. So hospitals and healthcare facilities should be a part of their region's healthcare emergency preparation coalition, or any other mutual aid agreements that happen to be in their particular area. On the telecom side, one thing you can do is you can register for fuel priority under the FCC's Disaster Information Reporting System. Some people might call it DIRS, D-I-R-S. And also register for fuel priority under the Telecommunications Service Priority, TSP, system. Both of those things are programs that actually give telecom operators two critical advantages during emergencies. First, you get faster restoration of critical network functions. If you're a member of the TSP, of the Telecom Service Priority, what that does is it will assign a priority code to your telecom service, to your data links, to your voice systems, to your control centers. And then, after a major disaster, service providers are legally required to restore TSP-tagged services before they restore non-prioritized customers, even other kinds of businesses. That means if you're registered beforehand in the TSP system, that means that your critical communications infrastructure gets earlier attention for repairs, for rerouting, for bandwidth restoration. Means it reduces your downtime. All of that sounds really good. So that means you should register for TSP. Second big advantage is you get priority access to fuel and priority access to emergency services. If you're registered in that DIRS, the DIRS system, DIRS registration lets you report real-time operational needs. If you got a fuel shortage at a generator-backed site, you report that directly to the FCC, which means it gets directly reported to emergency management agencies. And that matters because fuel vendors and emergency services will often consult the DIRS listings when trying to decide who's going to get refueling support first after a storm. And so if you are registered in the DIRS system, if you're registered in it and you have reported a problem, that means you're on the DIRS, the DIRS priority list. And that means you are far less likely to get stranded without fuel during a prolonged grid outage when the fuel deliveries are scarce for everybody else. So, important bottom line here on this fifth recommendation is DIRS and TSP registration. They give you formal government-backed priority for network restoration and generator refueling, which helps your telecom sites stay online when everyone else is competing for limited resources. Now, an example of this, real-life example of this was back in 2017 when Hurricane Maria went through and basically devastated Puerto Rico. After Maria, went through Puerto Rico, 95% of the cell towers in Puerto Rico were offline. Fuel shortages everywhere. Even operators who had generators, they couldn't keep them running because diesel delivery trucks were overwhelmed and they were prioritizing hospitals and government sites and other official services. And so the telecom companies, if they didn't have DIRS and TSP registrations, they had no formal claim to prioritize fuel deliveries or prioritized infrastructure. So there were many smaller carriers, many independent operators who didn't really know about this. They were all pushed to the back of the line. They didn't get to restore service for weeks. But the major carriers, the AT&Ts, the T-Mobiles, they already knew about this. They were pre-registered in the DIRS system. They had TSP priority codes already assigned for their key circuits, which means the major carriers, they were able to request diesel fuel and get on prioritized fuel resupply lists that were actually coordinated through FEMA and coordinated through local emergency ops centers. The major players, they were able to get in there. The smaller carriers who didn't know about this were out of luck. And the major carriers were also able to request emergency repair crews, and they got the priority access to the restricted disaster zones. That's important because in Puerto Rico, everything was a disaster zone, right? And they're limiting who can go where. And because AT&T, because T-Mobile and some of the other carriers had already been registered in these systems, they were actually given access to the restricted disaster zones that other people just couldn't go into. So AT&T, T-Mobile, we'll say Verizon, they were able to get in there, fix the fiber optic cables that had been cut, fix the towers, fix the switching equipment. So they were able to restore their critical coverage areas a lot faster than their unregistered competitors. So if you're in the telecom industry and you're not already in the DIRS system and you're not already registered for TSP, if you are not in those before a storm hits like it did in Puerto Rico, you're going to be fighting for the scraps afterwards. But if you are registered or you were registered, you've got a seat at the emergency management table. So get registered. That's recommendation number 5. Then final recommendation number 6, take the time now to train your people for scenarios, specifically scenarios where systems happen to fail. So the basic element of this recommendation is you should conduct what they call tabletop drills, and you should conduct them for outage scenarios that last longer than the fuel supply that you know you've got. So for healthcare facilities, that means tabletop drill for scenarios where you have ventilators, you have vaccine refrigeration units, you have electronic record systems. They need to remain online for days. If everything else is out, do you know how you're going to respond to that? A tabletop drill can help you with that. And on the telecom side, you should have tabletop drill that simulates multiple tower failures and how you might have to reroute network traffic to do load balancing and to make redundant node behavior, stuff like that. Tabletop drills are one of the smartest, most cost-effective ways to prepare for emergencies like hurricanes, especially when it comes to how you're going to deal with fuel and backup power operations in those critical sectors. So a tabletop drill, it's a guided scenario-based discussion, if you will, where key team members come together, they walk through their emergency plans that are in response to some hypothetical but realistic event, like a direct hurricane hit that causes power outages and fuel shortages. The goal here is not just to sit around and say, yay, we did a tabletop drill. No, the goal is you're looking to identify gaps, identify possible areas of confusion, identify unrealistic expectations that people hold, get all that out in the open so you can deal with that before that real emergency happens. It's low risk. There's no equipment downtime because it's a tabletop drill. You can do it in a meeting room. You can even do it virtually if you want. Think of it like a mental fire drill for your operations individuals. Okay, so how would a tabletop drill work? Okay, here's basically how you do one, okay? Number one is you got to pick a scenario. Pick a specific scenario. Again, specific but reasonable. Okay, so let's say Category 4 hurricane makes landfall within 100 miles of us and knocks out grid power for 5 days. And emergency fuel deliveries, as a result, are delayed by 72 hours. Okay, that's your specific scenario. Now, that's a serious scenario. It's also not completely unrealistic, too. So that makes it a good candidate for a tabletop drill. Okay, so you pick your scenario, then you assemble the people. Kinds of people need to participate and contribute to a tabletop drill. Operations managers seem obvious. Facilities teams, people who are on the facilities teams, like the generator experts and the fuel system experts. You want them in on this. IT and networking teams, especially important on telecom side, obviously. Communication staff, they need to be included. And a fifth group of people that you don't have to have them in there, but if you can, it might be a good idea, are vendor contacts. So those kinds of people, assemble all of them. And so you're going to walk through this emergency step by step. And by step, we're talking about time-wise, okay? So a general flow might be first 12 hours after this storm hits. What's supposed to activate? Who gets called? The rest of day one, how are you going to monitor fuel levels? What's going to be the protocol if your available fuel level drop below 50%? Okay, run through that. Day two, if a generator has an alarm or, God forbid, a generator fails, what is the escalation path and the protocol to deal with that? Days 3 through 5 for a 5-day event, how do you request emergency resupply? What are you going to do if you can reach the supplier, but they say, we can't get to you? What if the supplier can't reach you? All kinds of things that you need to talk about and plan for how you're going to respond to this in this tabletop drill. And then there's also the last part, recovery phase, because disasters don't just stop after day 5 and then everything goes back to normal. There's a recovery phase after that. So for your recovery phase, in your hypothetical, who decides when to return to normal operations and what has to happen in order for them to make that decision? Now, all along, while you're considering all of these things, you need to challenge assumptions that you might normally make. That's because if the assumptions that you had turn out to be wrong, you got real problems, right? What if maybe you assume that the automatic transfer switches are going to flip on at this point? What happens if they don't? What happens if the ATS fails? What happens if your cell service is down and your primary comms fail? What happens if those priority fuel contracts that you had lined up, what if they fall through for whatever reason? So you have to look at all of those assumptions, all those possibilities, and challenge them. What you're going to do if they turn out to be wrong. Because after it's all said and done, you want to document whatever findings come out of your drill. Do simple after-action reports. What did you find out that your strengths were? What weaknesses became apparent that maybe you didn't know about before? And what should the assignments be for all the stages of the situation? Who fixes what by when, for example? That kind of thing. So that's what a tabletop drill tends to look at. Tabletop drills, again, they can be really useful for emergency planning. They can be useful for fuel planning. You can drill your team on how much diesel fuel you really are going to need based on actual site load, not just on guesses. They can be useful to help you with supplier coordination, because one of the things you're likely to have to do is you're likely to have to identify and pre-clear secondary vendors or tertiary fuel vendors even. A tabletop drill can be helpful for generator testing procedures. Confirm who tests under load, who monitors the run hours, how you're going to recognize early warning signs of generator failure. Again, you're looking at all that beforehand, because if you don't, and that happens during an emergency, then you're dead in the water. So the bottom line here, tabletop drill is a really useful tool that exposes the hidden points, the hidden choke points where a hurricane can take your system offline, and then gives you a chance to fix them ahead of time when it still costs nothing but time. Okay, and then I know I said the sixth and final, actually we have a seventh. Seventh and final element of your preseason hurricane storm emergency planning steps is document everything. Document them for audits, document them for after action reviews. Keep your fuel receipts, keep your test results, keep your maintenance logs, keep your load test reports. Healthcare facilities are required to store all of these records in order to maintain compliance with CMS emergency preparation rules or preparedness rules. Telecom people, though, they don't have to deal with CMS, but telecom people should use what's called NOC level reporting tools. They're going to use those to track their run hours and to dispatch refueling alerts automatically. Now, since this is the last recommendation, temptation is to try and gloss over this to finish quickly, but this last part is actually important. So let's talk about CMS. CMS is Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. CMS requires all healthcare facilities, that means hospitals, skilled nursing facilities, clinics. They require them to document their emergency preparedness activities in detail. And CMS specifically calls out backup power and backup fuel systems to be included in it. Okay, document what? Here's what CMS expects regarding fuel and generator documentation. First, fuel testing and maintenance logs. CMS wants to see records that show when the fuel was tested for water, microbial contamination, and overall degradation. And CMS wants to see if things like biocides and stabilizers were used. Those treatments have to be documented. Okay, so CMS wants to see that. They also want to see generator testing logs. Remember, we said early on that every month you have to run a test under 30% rated load for 30 minutes. You have to document that, have records of all of those tests, those monthly tests. And you need to document that you did a 4-hour full load test at least once a year. And then, if any of those tests showed that you needed to do some kind of corrective action, you need to document that as well. CMS is going to want to see records of all of that. CMS is also going to want to see fuel inventory monitoring information, ongoing records of tank levels, calculations showing the minimum run time in either hours or days that your system would have relative to the amount of fuel that you have at a particular point in time. And if there is an emergency that happens, it doesn't have to be necessarily be a hurricane, could be something else. But if there's an emergency and you get refueled, they want to see a record of when that happened. Okay. You also want to see vendor agreements and fuel supply contracts. So you're going to need to keep copies of standing contracts with your emergency fuel delivery vendors, and you're going to want to file away proof that those suppliers are part of your recognized disaster response networks, if possible. Then last, CMS wants to see after-action reports from those drills that you did. If you did a tabletop exercise, what were the results? If you did any kind of live drill, what were the results of that? And if you did those and it led you to see that you need to update your emergency plan based on some lesson that you learned from your tabletop drill, if you did any of those changes, if you did any updates on that, you need to document that because CMS is going to want to see that you have taken that into account. So CMS surveys, they can and they will request these documents during inspections, especially if there's been any kind of declared emergency. And if you don't have this kind of documentation, there's consequences that come as well. You can get citations, you can get funding penalties. If it's really bad, you could even lose accreditation. Of course, everybody who works in hospital administration already knows that. Now, that's all been hospital stuff. What about on the telecom side? Remember, we talked about this NOC level stuff. let's talk a little bit about what we mean by that. So NOC is Network Operations Centers. Every telecom system has them. And in telecom operations, NOCs are responsible, Network Operations Centers are responsible for overseeing all the critical infrastructure. And so when it comes to backup power and fuel management, the documentation expectations are going to be things like the generator run hour logs, automatic logging of generator start-stop times, logging of cumulative run times. They want to see this because that kind of thing helps predict fuel consumption and helps schedule maintenance for that system. So they want to see that. And so one of the things that you can do, or what you're going to want to do, is you're going to want to establish automatic alerts. If a particular generator in your system, if its run hours, let's say, approaches a maintenance threshold, like some of them require oil changes every 250 hours. So you're going to want to establish an automatic alert to notify you so that you take care of that. Okay. Another thing NOC monitoring does has to do with fuel level monitoring. You want to have remote sensors in your fuel tanks that report real-time fuel levels back to the NOC, back to the Network Operations Center. And with those sensors, you can set thresholds, right? You can set a threshold, let's say 50% of tank level. You set the threshold so that if the fuel drops below that, it triggers an automatic refueling alert to the logistics team, which can then talk to the vendors and get that done. There's also alarm reporting, okay? Any generator alarms that you have, and generator alarms for telecom systems could be things like low oil pressure, coolant temperature, battery faults. Any kind of generator alarm that gets back to the NOC should automatically create a ticket or a dispatch alert for immediate action so that the problem can be looked at. Then, outage and restoration tracking, right? Incident logs showing when a site went on generator power, how long that generator power ran for, and then when that site returned to commercial power. The NOC needs to know all of that, not least because they have to do post-storm reporting to the FCC, especially if they're registered under the DIRS system that we talked about. And then vendor communication logs is the last one. NOC level notifications means they need records of emergency fuel requests, they need delivery confirmations, and notifications of any supply chain issues that might happen during storm events. So, going into hurricane season, if you're in the telecom sector, you are going to want to be using these kind of tools that allow telecom companies to prove their regulatory compliance and optimize their emergency response. So if you can set these up, then very likely one of the things it's going to give you is you're going to end up with an automated flow of data that sends all this important information to where and to who it needs to go to. And that means you don't need to worry about that. So, 7 big recommendations. For a number of them are general, but we also talked very specifically for hospitals and healthcare and for telecom. 7 big types of recommendations on what you can do now to prepare your system for hurricane season so that you don't get caught out by any unexpected problems. With that, that is going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. What the 2025 hurricane season is likely to look like, and the 7 areas of recommendation you need to look at ahead of time to make sure that you are most prepared to handle whatever the season is going to throw at you. Test your fuel quality, do your load testing, make sure that your fuel supply chain is adequate and set up, protect your infrastructure, coordinate your vendor deliveries to make sure that you're in line to get what you need, and get registered for those systems we talked about. Train your people to make sure that everyone knows what needs to be done and knows who's going to be doing what during critical emergency situation, and document everything. You do these things, you really will be ahead of the game, and it's going to save you a lot of headaches later. And having said all, that's going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Again, thank you very much for joining me as we walk through these issues. If you haven't done already, feel free to subscribe to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast on your podcast purveyor of choice. Give us a rating if you like what you heard. Tell your friends. And as usual, we will have links to all the kinds of things that we talked about in the show notes. So with that, that's going to do it. I'll see you next time for the next episode of Fuel Pulse Show podcast.